Hi everyone. Today we're going to go over our Unit 1 content terms. And the Unit 1 title is Comparative Government. Okay, so we're going to be looking at terms from terms that relate to different types of government and what governments can and can't do. Okay, you'll want to make sure that you have your marking period 1 reader out, and all of the terms that are on the first term sheet on the second page of your reader will be in this lecture. Okay, if you don't know a term, or if you don't think that I explained it well enough, please come and ask me. I'm more than happy to help you understand what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's start. The terms that we're actually going to go over today are right in front of you there. So we have autocracy, and it's really important that we say these correctly. Autocracy, not autocracy. It's autocracy, oligarchy, democracy, socialism, theocracy, monarchy, republic, legislative powers, executive powers, judicial powers, and economic systems. So let's get to work. An autocracy is when the government is ruled by one person. There is one person who is in charge, who makes all of the rules. Now you might think that that is automatically a bad thing. Like, I have the definition of dictatorship there, where political authority is held by a single person or entity. And in dictatorships, that one person or entity often has the power to regulate every aspect of public and private life. So that person tells you what can and cannot be done, expressly telling you what you should and shouldn't do. However, autocracies are not automatically a bad thing. There is a such thing as a benevolent dictator. It's really rare. However, it can exist. Like, what if there was a dictator, an autocrat, who told you that you had to do certain things, but that those actual things were good things to do? There have been a few examples in the past of benevolent dictators, not really a ton, but Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore generally was thought to be good, and the people in Singapore, he was in charge in the late 20th century, generally thought to be a pretty good autocrat, but he was an autocrat. On the other side, you have dictators or totalitarians, and if you look at that term that I have there, totalitarianism is also a type of autocracy. Dictators, if you've been paying attention to the news recently, you'll know that North Korea has come in the news fairly recently, and Kim Jong-un has been a dictator. His father, Kim Jong-il, has been a dictator, and Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, was also a dictator. And those three have been in power since the end of World War II in North Korea. So it has more often than not had a negative connotation to be an autocrat. Often we see propaganda that's used to perpetuate power and suppress dissent. So if there's something that the autocrat doesn't like, then they will use the media, they will use propaganda in a way that reflects better on them, and not even reflects better, that proves that their way is the right way and that there is no room for another opinion. So that's autocracy. A monarchy. You might be a little bit more familiar with what a monarchy is. In a monarchy, there's a single ruler, a king or a queen, and oftentimes that title is inherited. So in places where there are monarchies or have been monarchies, if the monarch has and most of the time it was a male-dominated monarchy. But if the king or the queen has a son, that son will be the head of the family. And this is where it can kind of get confusing, because if there are multiple children, if there are people who claim that they are the correct ruler, then wars can start, and wars did start. There's a huge conflict called the Wars of the Roses in England in the 1400s. That's all about who is supposed to be in charge. That war is actually the basis for the TV show and books Game of Thrones. It's all about who's in charge of the country. Being a monarch doesn't mean that you necessarily have full control, but it is possible that monarchs are also potentially dictators, but that's not necessarily the case. The next term that we have is oligarchy. An oligarchy is when there are a few people in charge. Usually these people are rich and powerful families, but you can just have a group of people be oligarchs. That they don't have to be related. More often than not, oligarchs are wealthy, and one of their main goals is to maintain that wealth and that status over everyone else. So the example that I have in front of you here, this picture on the left, is of the mafia. I think this picture is from the 20s or 30s. And if you think about it like that, if you've ever seen any of the Godfather movies, or if you've watched any TV shows or movies that have this thing called the mafia in it, it's often stylized so that, there's one family, and that family's goal is to make sure that they are continually becoming wealthy at the expense of everyone else. So in an oligarchy, the power is going to a group, and that group of people makes decisions on how to run things. This mafia example is obviously a more local example or smaller example than running a whole country. However, some people have suggested recently that the United States is turning into more of an oligarchy, that the United States is potentially ruled by the rich, by the wealthy, and that real people don't have a say in government at all. Especially now that, because of a ruling a few years ago called Citizens United, companies can now donate to professional or to politicians' campaigns. So how much say do we really have as people? That's an argument that's around now, to make a case that the United States is an oligarchy, but you can be the judge of that for yourself. The next one you're probably familiar with, a democracy. In a democracy, which you may have participated in some aspect of a small democracy, citizens vote to pass laws. So citizens get a say. You can have a direct democracy where you vote on laws. So if we had a direct democracy in the United States, which we don't, there would be a law that is proposed, and every citizen would have the opportunity to vote on that law, and majority wins in direct democracy, I'd say most of the time. But we don't have a direct democracy in the United States. We also don't have a parliamentary democracy, but that's another system of democracy. Parliamentary democracy is found in England, it's found in Canada, it's found in Australia, a few other European countries. It's a little bit more confusing, or I shouldn't say it's a little bit more confusing, but it's different than what we have in the United States. So a party, a political party, or a coalition, which means a group or a few parties working together, they form the government. And they are the ones who are making laws. If you are not part of that party, or if you're not in that coalition, you're still serving, but you really don't have much power to do much of anything. Parliamentary democracy makes it easier for legislation to get passed because the government is controlled by the party who is the majority. And if you were following, there was an election in the spring and early summer in England that was called because Prime Minister Theresa May decided to call an election when she didn't think that she had a majority of the legislature anymore. And there was a big debate about, well, who's going to be the majority, because there wasn't a clear majority party in the UK Parliament. So that's another recent example of what parliamentary democracy looks like. You'll get more information on this this week and next week. The next system that we have is a republic. So in a republic, the people hold the power. We have a version of a republic in the United States. So when we vote in elections, we're not, let's say this, when I voted in November, I wasn't voting directly for the president. I was voting for someone else to vote for the president for me. That's what the Electoral College is, which we will talk about later this year. And right now we vote for senators and we vote for congressmen and women who represent our interests in Washington. The main thing about a republic is that the rule of law and equal rights of citizens are stressed. So rule of law means that everyone, all citizens are equal and can be held responsible to the same laws. So just because you are a senator or because you're a president or because you're a congressperson, that does not mean that you can do things that one of us can't do. So under the rule of law, everyone is held to the same standard and held to the same laws as everyone else. Equal rights of citizens means exactly what you think it means. It means that citizens should have equal right under the law. All citizens should have equal rights under the law. Now you can make the case that in the United States, in the history of the United States, those two things, rule of law and equal rights of citizens, haven't necessarily been held up. That's certainly a case that historians have argued in the past. But those are some of the defining features of a republic. Our next term is socialism. Socialism is not necessarily a government system, but it's a social and economic system. In socialism, property is not really owned by an individual. So property is owned by a collective group, and rather than sell things for a profit, you produce things to use them and for everyone else to use them. So if I was a farmer, rather than harvesting my crops at the end of the season and selling them to make money, I would harvest my crops and give them to everyone else in return for the things that everyone else would give me. So there's limited private property, and profit is not the goal. The goal is really social equality, an elimination of classes. The next term that we have is a theocracy. Theocracy is when a deity is the one who is in charge of your state. By state, I mean nation or country. An example of this that you may or may not have considered is the Vatican City, which is its own country. Vatican City is inside Italy, but it is its own country. And the person in charge of Vatican City is the Pope. So the Pope is the one in charge of that country, and the laws that are made are passed down from God to the Pope, who then implements God's will in legislation that he crafts. So a theocracy is not really run by people per se. It's carried out by people, but in a theocracy, the country is ruled by God or whatever deity there is. Okay, so our final section here is going to be on legislative powers. So whenever we talk about legislators, we're talking about laws. Okay, so if you just want to get that mnemonic device down, legislative means laws. And legislative powers are powers to make the laws. There is a process for making laws in the United States, just as there is a process for making laws elsewhere in the world. Lawmaking, I also have on here, can include other powers like passing a budget, which is something that's going to be coming in the news pretty soon. Confirming officials, so people who are working for the government, they have to be, in many cases, approved by these lawmakers, making trade deals and other things like that, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Those are just some of the things that you'll see our legislators doing fairly often. And at the bottom here, we have pictures of the U.S. Capitol building, which is where the senators and representatives in the United States work. This is the main building of legislation in Norway, and I actually got to see that this past summer. And this is Parliament in the UK, which is right on the Thames. That is also at the top there. That is another guy in Parliament, a guy by the name of George Clinton, and I'm sure none of you will understand who he is, but he was in the group Parliament Funkadelic. Look it up. All right, so the next thing that we have here is executive powers. Executive powers. Executive powers are the powers to execute the laws of a country. So there is, in many cases, depending on which form of government we're in, there is an executive. So someone who is in charge of making sure that the laws are carried out correctly. That's really the main job of the executive. Above all, this executive needs to defend the people from threats against laws of the country and from outside threats of the country as well. Here I have the residences of the main executives of the United States, of the UK, and India. So these are the residences of the chief executive of those countries. Finally, we have judicial powers. Judicial powers, judges, right? When we talk about judicial processes or something that's judicial powers, we're talking about judges, we're talking about the law. And judicial powers are to basically determine whether or not the laws are fair and if citizens have broken those laws. There are a lot of different types of courts, but you're probably familiar with the United States Supreme Court. There are also state Supreme Courts here in the United States. But basically the job is to determine whether or not the laws are fair and who has or hasn't broken them. Okay, that's really what it boils down to. And I have the judicial buildings of Mexico on the right, India in the center, and a pretty cool building. This is actually the Iowa State Supreme Court building. I thought it looked cool, and rather than put the United States Supreme Court, I decided to go with the one from Iowa. All right, so the last thing that I need to talk about here is economic systems. Economic systems focus on who gets what in a country. Resources. You can boil that down to things like food and water, electricity. Any resource that you think of is being dealt with by the economic system. There are probably two that you've really heard of, and the government system, the ones that I just talked about, can have any level of control. So the government can be completely in charge of resources. The government cannot have anything to do with resources, and anywhere in the middle. The one that you've probably heard of, which we have not a pure version of in the United States, but a version of in the United States, is capitalism. So there's a lot of ownership of private property. Right? If you own your house, you are owning private property. If you own a business, you're owning private property. Price is how things get determined. So who has what is determined by how much things cost. And anyone can do business with anyone else. That's what free exchange means. You can do business with whoever you want to do business with. Communism is also probably the other one that you may have heard of. It was an ideology of this guy named Karl Marx, who was an economist in the 1800s. And in addition to it being an economic system, it was also a social system. Marx believed that everyone should be equal. You shouldn't be able to own private property. But that's never really worked up to this point. And when it's happened, it's resulted in a dictatorship, because one person comes along and says, this is what we should do, and then makes everybody else do it, but they're still in charge, which kind of flies in the face of what communism theoretically should be. Okay? So communism and capitalism, those are the two primary economic systems that we're going to talk about in this class, or at least in this first unit. Please make sure that if you have any questions about these, you ask me. The project that we're going to be doing starting tomorrow, or very soon, is going to focus on these different forms of government, and you're going to go more in depth with one of them. All right, so please make sure that in the process of this project, you ask me questions about it. Okay? Thanks, everybody. Make sure that you finish this video all the way to the end. Have a great day.